10 days after filling in San Jacinto, my dad started his leave of absence from work proper. The first thing he wanted to do was fill in the last section of those first 700 miles. He still had 75 miles after Wrightwood. He'd hike those with a hiking partner for the first time since day 2. My grandfather dropped off my dad and Mr. Peters at Inspiration Point, just past Wrightwood at mile 369. Mr. Peters was a fellow adult leader of my Boy Scout troop. They immediately ran into a trail crew, so it was no surprise the trail was in great shape. They paralleled Highway 2 for 5 miles, occasionally dipping down right next to the highway until they reached Vincent Gulch. As they approached the rest stop for the trailhead of Mount Baden-Powell, they crossed the Highway 2. Somewhere past Inspiration Point, the highway was already completely closed down. It was eerie walking on such a large road that had no traffic on it at all. In front of the trailhead's restroom, they met 4 other thru hikers. Since Mr. Peters didn't own microspikes, crampons, or an ice axe, my dad didn't bother to bring his. They decided the prudent course was to skip the peak and just walk Highway 2. After all, without the proper gear, the peak would be dangerous, and more importantly, how often do you get the chance to walk right down the middle of a highway? My dad asked Mr. Peters to give Mount Baden-Powell a scout salute. Mr. Peters was a great sport and played along. While walking the highway, Caltrans workers would pass them in trucks, snowplows, and dump trucks. One of the people at Vincent Gulch rest stop described Highway 2 as apocalyptic. Although it wasn't quite that bad, there were places where piles of debris, giant rocks, and snow blocked portions of the road. At one point, the highway was undercut drastically on the downhill side and would require a major repair. Other places, the guardrails were bashed and broken by fallen rocks. Service vehicles could get through, so at no place the highway was fully blocked. The piles of debris were organized to allow front loaders to fill the dump trucks so that the debris could be transported off the mountain. They stopped at an old spot meant to allow motorists to fill up their radiators to prevent overheating. Modern cars don't overheat as easily, so the spot had gone into disrepair. At mile 386, the trail came down from Mount Baden-Powell and rejoined Highway 2. This was the Islip Pass and rest stop. My dad and Mr. Peters considered camping there. Obviously, if the highway was open, it wouldn't be allowed, but there were clearly spots where tents had been put up. Later on, when my dad and Mr. Peters were refilling water at the snowbank, a ranger stopped and confirmed that it was fine to camp at any day-use area while the highway was closed. At Islip Pass, old Highway 39 would have joined Highway 2 if it hadn't been temporarily closed back in 1978. Mr. Peters and my dad were still feeling good, and it was early, so they decided to keep hiking. Instead of following the trail up towards Mount Williamson, they stuck to the highway. Another hiker that was at the rest area with them described the section of the trail as PUD, pointless up and down. Besides, if they stayed at Highway 2, they'd be able to walk through the Angeles Crest tunnels, and how often do you get to do that? On the other side of the tunnels, they were ready for camp. As they were setting up camp, a man named Dan came by on his truck. He was technically a resident, so he was allowed on the road. He was doing trail magic. He said he'd give them a ride to his lodge where they could stay, and he'd barbecue up some hot dogs for them. Staying there was awesome. It was a lot of fun hanging out with Dan and a couple of other hikers. Harry from New Zealand and Mike. In the morning, Mr. Peters and my dad road walked back to the PCT at mile 389. At one point, they passed some pine drops. Mr. Peters, who was a biologist, explained they were parasites feeding off the roots of pine trees. They stopped at the Glenwood Dads Club and at 3 Points rest stop. At one point, they passed under and over some utility lines that were in pretty bad shape. Hopefully, they weren't power lines. The day ended at mile 411 after a pretty serious climb, but at least they got a really good view. The next morning, it was all downhill to Mill Creek Summit Fire Station, where they go for some trail magic. They both enjoyed orange crushes with their lunches. Unfortunately, over the last 2 days, Mr. Peters developed some pretty serious blisters, and so the pair had to slow down and choose to stick to the Mount Gleason Road, which paralleled the trail. They camped at the Station Fire Memorial. Is at the site of the ruins of what looked to be a hotel. The location also looked to be used now and then by Wildlands firefighters. That night, the fog rolled in and stuck with them for most of the rest of the trip. It was nice because it cooled down what could have been a couple of really hot days. The next day, they only hiked 9 miles to North Fork Ranger Station. It's been closed since the station fire back in 2009. Because Mr. Peters' feet were in really bad shape, they came up with a plan to end the hike early. Gould said my grandfather could drive to the ranger station, so Mr. Peters would stay with the packs and wait for my grandfather, and my dad would trail run to Acton. Well, 6.5 miles to Acton, my dad got notified by his inReach that my grandfather was stopped by a closed gate, so my dad had to turn around. So my dad got to hike an extra 13 miles, lucky. Although he did see some pretty flowers. And a lovely stream at a campsite. The ranger station has the biggest propane tank my dad had ever seen. The last morning on the trail was crazy foggy. My dad joked that the simulations must be running short of rendering resources. #simulation hypothesis. At one point they passed orange masses of parasites feeding off some green bushes. Thanks, Mr. Peters, for the info. They came down off the trail only 8 miles at Indian Canyon Trailhead, and they just needed to cross Soledad Canyon Road and enter LA Action RV Park, have lunch, and wait for my granddad. Snake count, 7. My dad might have walked right by if Mr. Peters hadn't yelled when he spotted the monster gopher snake. Trail stops checklist, none, but they filled in the trail between Wrightwood and Acton.